It is a great day to be with everybody, but it's also been a great week, as Cameron alluded to or mentioned directly in his prayer. It's been a great time for us to be together to study God's Word during our recent Vacation Bible School, and it was a very uplifting and encouraging week for me because we had great attendance across the board. We had great attendance with our kids. We had great attendance in the old class, many of whom were here every single day. And if we're not here every day, we're here most of the days. And so I want you to know how much we appreciated that, especially me, because as I told the adult class a few times, I knew the kids would be here. I didn't know how many adults we would have. And so I thought it may be 5 or 6 of us just kind of sitting in the auditorium. You never really know. But we had great attendance across the board. And so I really appreciate that. And as was mentioned also in the prayer, and I appreciate Cameron bringing this up too, the talents that we saw on display this last week were phenomenal. There were so many people that contributed so many amazing things. And so I want to take just a brief second, real briefly, to publicly thank all of those people. I don't have a list of names. I'm not going to do that. But if you were involved in any part, and I know there were some people that were involved in kind of smaller ways, and there were some people that were involved in some really big ways, regardless of your participation, I want you to know how much I appreciate it, how much the kids appreciated it. I never heard any negative comments about the entire week, and I get at least 2 every week about my sermon. So I know that there was something that went right this week, and so I appreciate everybody's participation in that. Last month, if you were here, this is not anything to do with VBS, but if you were here last month, you were probably privy to, on Mother's Day, a sermon that I did called Lovingly, the Worst Mother's Day Sermon Ever. And I'll admit to you, that was a really dicey title. As I talked about in that sermon, I got up that morning and I didn't know if I was going to have a job by that afternoon. You just never really know, because Mother's Day is not the time when you want to get up and start talking about the story of JL, which also involves tent pegs. And so I didn't really know how that day was going to go. And I had a couple questions afterwards, mainly people asking me, are you going to do something similar to Father's Day? I don't have a worst Father's Day sermon ever. In case you thought that I was going to come up here and have something that was equally as kind of outlandish as that wasn't ever in the cards for today. I do have a sermon, though, that's on Caleb, and Caleb and his different spirit. This is a pretty often overlooked story, I think, in Scripture. Oftentimes when we look at the story of Caleb, we almost always say, yeah, and that guy that was right alongside Joshua. And Joshua's really the star, isn't he? Joshua has a book after him. Joshua is the one that's the leadership position alongside Moses. And so Caleb just kind of is a hanger-on. And the more I look at the story of Caleb, the more I'm impressed with his ability, not necessarily to take the lead and be the forefront, but to kind of be that steady, forceful hand behind the scenes that in so many ways exemplifies what true leadership is about. We're going to be in Numbers 14, so go ahead and flip over to that. As you know, Caleb and Joshua were the 2 men that were, or the 2 people rather, that were allowed to go into Canaan. They were the only 2 that we know of that were allowed to go into Canaan. Because as he says in Numbers chapter 14, starting in verse 25 down to the end of the chapter, everybody over the age of 20 is going to perish in the wilderness. Caleb is the only one, alongside Joshua, that has the honor of being the old man in Canaan, which I think is weird to be the only person in that demographic. Nobody within 20 years or so of you as you're entering into Canaan, but that's a different story. In Numbers chapter 14, though, starting in verse 20, God gives some credence. God gives some flowers to Caleb that I think is interesting. He says in verse 20, I have pardoned them according to your word. That's Moses' plea on behalf of the people, according to Moses' word. But indeed, as I live, all the earth will be filled with all the glory of the Lord. And surely all the men who have seen my glory, my signs which I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, yet have put me to the test these 10 times, and have not listened to my voice, shall by no means see the land which I swore to their fathers, nor shall any of those who spurned me see this. But, verse 24, my servant Caleb, because he has had a different spirit and has followed me fully, I will bring to the land which he entered, and his descendants shall take possession of it. This is an interesting statement, because oftentimes when we look at what God, or the way that the Bible operates, it gives very kind of normal terms to describe people. It talks about somebody being righteous, it talks about somebody being holy, but rarely does it accentuate a certain characteristic of somebody, and when it does, it usually does so in relatively vague terms. Think, for instance, this last week when we talked about Noah. Noah is talked about as being more righteous than anybody else. He is kind of the beacon. Well, what does that mean? What does that mean that Noah, amidst everybody else, was the one person who seemed righteous above anybody else? We don't really know exactly what he's talking about here. And so when it mentions in Numbers chapter 14, verse 24, that he has a different spirit, you can qualify that by saying that he followed him fully. And so maybe that's the different spirit he's talking about. Everybody else in the room obviously just kind of went crazy and they all followed after all these different things. And it seems like Caleb didn't do that, so maybe that's the different spirit that we're talking about. But I think you can look at certain qualities of Caleb and say, okay, that's a little bit different, at least than his contemporaries. Jump back to Numbers chapter 13. Notice the bravery that Caleb exemplifies in Numbers chapter 13, starting in verse 21. It says in Numbers chapter 13, verse 21, when they went up and spied out the land from the wilderness of Zin as far as Rehob at Lebo Hamath, when they had gone up to the Negev, they came to Hebron, where Ahiman, Shishai, and Talmai, and the descendants of Anak were. Now, Hebron was built 7 years before Zoan in Egypt. Those are some historical notes, but it also gives you some evidence there in verse 22 that the people that they're encountering are giants. And specifically, as he mentions, these are giants in Hebron. We're going to be talking about that here in just a second. It says, then they came to the valley of Eshcol, and from there cut down a branch with a single cluster of grapes. And they carried it on a pole between two men with some of the pomegranates and the figs. That place was called the Valley of Eshcol because of the cluster which the sons of Israel cut down from there. There's one sense in which Caleb is brave, the fact that he even goes on this to begin with. These men are selected not necessarily because of their fighting warrior spirit, but because, as is talked about earlier in the chapter, because they are chiefs of these individual tribes. That's where Caleb came from. So he was already seen as somebody, even as a relatively young man, that was brave, that was honorable, who you could trust. And so the fact that he went into Canaan to begin with, I think, is remarkable. Verse 25, when they turned from spying out the land at the end of 40 days, they proceeded to come to Moses and Aaron, all the congregation of the sons of Israel. In the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh, they brought back word to them, to all the congregation, and showed them the fruit of the land. And thus they all told him, in unison essentially, we went into the land where you sent us, and it certainly does flow with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. Look at all these grapes we got. Nevertheless, the people who live in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and are very large. And moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak there. Amalek is living in the land of the Negev. The Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amorites are living in the hill country, and the Canaanites are living by the sea and by the side of the Jordan. You have a very factual report. We went into the land, and it was exactly, this is a really important part, it was exactly as God said it would be. God really didn't beat around the bush. He said it was awesome, and it's awesome. But then there's another little factual note, the descendants of Anak there. And that's where we have a little pause. We saw the giants, we saw the people, and these weren't just guys that were tall that have no athletic ability like me. These are people that are tall and can fight. Because that's the warfaring civilization. So when he's looking at the people of Anak, he's talking about very, very fearsome warriors. And there's no dissent necessarily at this point, and yet verse 30, Caleb quiets the people. And he says, we should by all means go up and take possession of it, for we will surely overcome it. But the men who had gone up with him said, we're not able to go up against the people. Were you there, Caleb? Did you get the memo? They're way too strong for us. So they gave out to the sons of Israel a bad report of the land which they had spied out, saying, the land which we had gone through in spying it out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people whom we saw in it were men of great size. We also saw the Nephilim. Sons of Anak are part of the Nephilim. We got giants and their cousins. And we became like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. The general consensus among the entirety of the people is, yeah, God was spot on with what he said, but there's no possible way we can overtake it. And Caleb anticipates this descent. And he says, guys, we can do it. You just said it was exactly as God said originally. We can do it now. Caleb was brave in the sense that not only was he willing to go in there, but he was also brave in the sense that he was willing to stand up to these people. But there is a little note in this, and this is something that is not oftentimes seen, and I'm not going to necessarily hang my hat on there, but there is a strong Jewish tradition centering around Caleb in these verses, that as you look back specifically at verse, what is it, when he mentions there? When he mentions in verse, somewhere in here, don't tell me, I know exactly what it is. Verse 20, or I'm in chapter 14, that's why I'm not seeing it. In chapter 13, verse 22, it says, when they had gone up in the Negev, they came to Hebron. There is a strong Jewish tradition that the they should not be translated into the plural, but rather should be he talking about Caleb. Now, I'm not necessarily going to hang my hat on that, like I just said, but I think if it's true, that does give credence to the idea that Caleb is the only one of the spies that goes directly into the land of Hebron and sees the giants. In case you're wondering about more evidence of that, if you look at Numbers chapter 14 and verse 24, which is on your screen right there, the second half of that verse says, I'm going to give him, Caleb, the land which he went into. And Joshua chapter 15 describes how Caleb directly inherited the land of Hebron. And so it's very likely, I don't not going to say this as gospel truth necessarily, but there's a very strong tradition surrounding the idea that all the spies went into Canaan, but Caleb went a little bit further. And that even in the midst of all this fear that took place, Caleb said, well, I'm going to check out Hebron. I don't care about the giants. I don't care about the descendants of Anak. I'm going to go check this out just a little bit further. Was he brave? Yes. Arguably the bravest person that existed in Israel at the time. But he was also, I would argue, pretty patient. Look in Joshua chapter 14, starting in verse 6. Very next book over. Or two books over, rather. Joshua chapter 14, starting in verse 6. This is many years after the conquest. After the original spy incursion in Numbers chapter 14. In Joshua chapter 14, starting in verse 6. This is after they've conquered most of Canaan. That took probably 10 or so years roundabouts. Maybe 5, maybe a little bit less. Then the sons of Judah drew near to Joshua in Gilgal, and Caleb the son of Jephunneh the Kenites said to him, you know the word which the Lord spoke to Moses, the man of God, concerning you and me in Kadesh Barnea. I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land, and I brought word back to him as it was in my heart. I told you the truth, and I believed then, as I believe now, that we can take Canaan. Nevertheless, verse 8, my brethren who went up with me made the heart of the people melt with fear, but I followed the Lord my God fully. And so Moses swore on that day, saying, surely the land on which your foot has trodden, this gives more evidence to that tradition, the land on which your foot has trodden will be an inheritance to you and to your children forever, because you have followed the Lord my God fully. Now behold, the Lord has let me live just as he spoke these 45 years, from the time that the Lord spoke this word to Moses when Israel walked in the wilderness, and now behold, I am 85 years old today, 45 years past the spy incursion in the book of Numbers. I am still as strong today as I was in the day Moses sent me. And as my strength was then, so is my strength now for war, for going out and coming in. Now then, give me this hill country about which the Lord spoke on that day. For you heard on the day that the Anakim were there with great fortified cities, that perhaps the Lord will be with me, and I will drive them out as the Lord has spoken. Keep in mind how long Caleb has been waiting for this promise. He was the only guy alongside Joshua that spoke up amongst the 12 spies and said, guys, I think we can do this. God has taken us here. We've seen the miracles. We've seen the sustenance. I think we can do this. We need faith. And everybody, of course, said, I don't know about that. And then they balk, and they go back, and they balk again. There's all this little dissent. And Caleb parks it on the sidelines. You don't see anything about him in the rest of the book of Numbers past Numbers chapter 14. And he parks it. In Joshua chapter 14, he speaks up. He's like, guys, I've waited 45 years for this. And guess what? I've been doing P90X. I've been lifting weights. I've kept my nutrition up. And I'm just as strong today as I was then. But more importantly, God is with me. And it's about time that I take advantage of that promise. Let me ask you real quick, and this is a good mental exercise that you can do during the course of this sermon. What other promise can you think of in the entirety of Scripture that lasted longer than 45 years? Abraham is seen as a great paradigm of faith because he maintained faith in God about his promises for 30 years. That's great. Also, small potatoes to Caleb, sitting on the sidelines, waiting year after year after year, probably getting a little mad at his compatriots for not listening to him. And when the time was right, Joshua chapter 14, verse 6 through 12, he says, I'm getting that land. God's going to be with me, and I'm going after that. If that's not the essence of patience, I don't know. He was also, I would argue, pretty bold. And more so than him being bold, his family was bold. Joshua 15, starting verse 13, he gave to Caleb the son of Jephunneh a portion among the sons of Judah, according to the command of the Lord to Joshua, namely Kiriath Arba. Arba being the father of Anak, that is Hebron. Arba is a great warrior by himself. Caleb drove out from there the 3 sons of Anak, Shishai, Ahiman, and Talmai, the children of Anak. Then he went up from there against the inhabitants of Debir. Now the name of Debir formerly was Kiriath Sepher. And Caleb said, the one who attacks Kiriath Sepher and captures it, I will give him Achsah, my daughter, as a wife. Just happens to be the first judge, by the way, eventually. Othniel, the son of Kenaz, the brother of Caleb, captured it. So he gave him Achsah, his daughter, as a wife. And it came about that when she came to him, this is Caleb's daughter. Caleb's daughter came to him. She persuaded him to ask her father for a field. So she alighted from the donkey. Caleb said to her, what do you want? And she said, give me a blessing, since you have given me the land to give. Give me also the springs of water. So he gave her the upper springs and the lower springs. This is a characteristic you don't see that often. Because here you have 85-year-old Caleb out here bashing skulls with a bunch of giants. And I know what you're thinking to yourself. He's probably not the one killing people. David was, until David got forced into retirement by his generals. But even if Caleb wasn't out there doing that, he's still the one sending his direct relatives and his own personal army into the land of Hebron to destroy these people. Is he brave? Yeah. He's out here 85 years old fighting guys that are a fourth of his age, that are 3 times his size. And he's doing it without an ounce of fear in his body, at least as determined that we can come from this. And so if you want to talk about somebody who is absolutely a different spirit, he was, as we would say in today's world, he was just built different. That's just who Caleb was. And so you can argue that Caleb has a different spirit because of these 3 qualities. I have no argument with that. That's where you want to stop and say he's brave, patient. Bold is the third one. Bold is the third one. Obviously, the copy-paste failed me there. He was bold, brave, patient, and bold. You can stop there if you want to. But I don't think that personifies everything about who Caleb was. Was he brave, patient? Was he brave? Yes. He was also bold. He was all 3 or 4 of those things. What made Caleb, in my opinion, different was that he took drastic action to protect his family. Now, I know what you're thinking. There is nowhere really in these 45 years of Caleb fulfilling this promise that seems to imply drastic action. 45 years is a long time to hold on to a promise. So you got the longevity thing going for you there. But also think about this. During those 45 years, from Numbers 14 all the way to the end of the book, you have 40 plus years there happening. You have multiple things taking place inside the land of Canaan, inside the Israelite camp. You have Caleb sitting by the side, where in Numbers chapter 16, you have Korah rolls up and demands that Moses give him some kind of honor, give him some kind of leadership. And in the midst of all that, Korah gets eaten up by the earth. His people and his friends get annihilated by fire. And Caleb's just sitting there, not going to have a part in that. And then when you look at Numbers chapter 21, right when they're on the doorstep, whenever Balaam shows up and leads all these people into sexual immorality, 24,000 people die. Caleb's not a part of it. Caleb withholds his family from all of those different things, which would have been very not in vogue for a lot of those people. A lot of those people are looking at Moses and looking at Joshua and thinking to themselves, we got to do something about this. And the drastic action that Caleb took was not bashing people around with tent pegs, but was in the calm, steady hand of maintaining and holding on to the promise. And that's sometimes what drastic action looks like. Drastic action doesn't always look like us going out there and really taking charge and making things happen. In some ways, it means withholding ourselves in a period of temperance while the rest of the world just goes absolutely bananas. I want you to go to the book of 2 Samuel with me, if you would. 2 Samuel chapter 23. Think of how many people, this is kind of as a side point, think of how many people throughout the course of Numbers whined and complained and bickered and fought, and yet whose name is notably absent from all of those? Caleb's. Caleb never seems to be a part of the discontent. He never seems to be a part of the issues. He's in the background on purpose. In 2 Samuel chapter 23, starting in verse 8, sometimes you see drastic action take multiple forms. In 2 Samuel 23, starting in verse 8, it says, "These are the names of the mighty men whom David had. Josheba, Bas-Hebeth." Mine's on 2 lines, so that was hard for me. A Techmanite, chief of the captains. He was called Adino of the Isnite because of 800 slain by him at one time. That's a big deal. And after him was Eleazar, the son of Dodo the Ahohite, one of 3 mighty men with David, when they defied the Philistines, were gathered there to battle, and the men of Israel had withdrawn. Verse 10 is super interesting, by the way. He arose and struck the Philistines until his hand was weary and clung to his sword. That means his muscles were so overexhausted that he couldn't unclench his fist from the sword. That's how far he pushed himself. The Lord brought about a great victory that day, and the people returned after him only to strip the slain. The rest of this chapter goes in depth on the mighty men and their feats. If you wonder to yourself, why were they called the mighty men? Well, 2 Samuel 23 is your answer. They were called mighty men because of all the things they did. Then look at verse 10. After him was Shammah, the son of Agi, a Hararite. The Philistines were gathered into a troop when there was a plot of ground full of lentils, and the people fled from the Philistines. But he took his stand in the midst of the plot, defended it, and struck the Philistines, and the Lord brought about a great victory. Good for him. until you realize that he did it alone. What takes place in 2 Samuel chapter 23, verses 11 and 12, is a man who looks at the situation and says, all right, you've got this ground that is full of beans. And maybe these beans are sufficient, maybe they're provisions, maybe they're not. And everybody else retreats from the battle because they're not going to stand against these Philistines in the midst of these beans. They're not going to protect the beans at the cost of their lives. And yet this guy stands up and says, look, even if I have to fight alone, I'm going to fight and I'm going to defend our territory, our provisions, because it's for the safeguard of my family. As you think about your own life, there are moments when you may be the only voice in the room telling the world around you that everyone needs to chill out, that I'm going to make a stand for what's right, that it doesn't matter how much things are going haywire, I'm going to do what's right, even if I have to stand by myself. And it may be that even the people around you who call themselves Christians, they fully retreated from the battle because they're willing to give up territory, even vital territory, in the name of self-defense. But you stand. And isn't that what Ephesians chapter 6 talks about? Ephesians chapter 6, verses 10 through 18, the description that Paul gives about the armor of God begins and ends with the same sentence. He says, having done all, to stand. Drastic action doesn't always look like what JL did with a tent peg in one hand and a hammer in the other. Sometimes drastic action means being willing to stand when even the people that you trust to stand with you have fled from the battlefield. In Job chapter 16, Job understands this because he's in the middle of listening to three friends visibly flee the battlefield in front of him. In Job 16, Job chapter 16 and verse 6. Job 16 and verse 6. Job gets more and more vulnerable throughout this book. He gets more and more angry, I would argue, too. Job 16 and verse 6, he says, if I speak, my pain is not lessened. And if I hold back, what is left me? But now he has exhausted me. You have laid waste all my company. You have shriveled me up. It has become a witness, and my leanness rises up against me. It testifies to my face. His anger has torn me and has hunted me down. He has gnashed at me with his teeth. My adversary glares at me. They have gaped at me with their mouth. They have slapped me on the cheek with contempt. They have massed themselves against me. God hands me over to ruffians and tosses me into the hands of the wicked. I was at ease, but he shattered me. And he has grasped me by the neck and shaken me to pieces, and he has also set me up as his target. Job is arguing here that he stands completely by himself, not even in the midst of his friends, but also in the midst of God. And some of that is what he shouldn't be saying. He shouldn't be talking about God in such terms. But Job's one defining characteristic throughout the entirety of the book is that even though it seems like circumstances and his own friends are willing to tear down his integrity, he stands firm. That's drastic to those people. How many people do you know in your own life, sometimes people who call themselves Christians, have asked you to compromise your morals in order to do X, Y, and Z? Have asked you and have told you that this is a much better way if you want what's best to your family. And you're listening to that and you're thinking, that's not at all what I need. Well, if you want to really get ahead at work, if you really want to have your kid advance in school, if you really want to do all these different things and really provide, you have to do all these things that maybe cut some corners, maybe compromise your attendance, maybe cause you not to lean so much on God, but lean more on your own understanding. And yet what you see for 45 years is Caleb maintaining the course over a period when everybody else in Israel was going bananas. Which makes me wonder, do I have a different spirit to lead my family? Everybody in this room, I'm looking around, I'm seeing a bunch of great fathers. Happy Father's Day to all of us, by the way. I'm looking around in this room and I'm seeing a lot of really, really, really strong men. And if I ask that question, do I have that same type of different spirit to lead my family, which isn't always drastic action. Sometimes it's standing. Sometimes it's just persevering. Do I have that spirit? There's my microphone. Do I have that spirit? Look in Exodus chapter 32 rather. This time period in Moses' life, which Caleb would have been around for, this time period in Moses' life was filled with arguments and filled with tension. There was a lot of uncertainty in the world. And as Moses ascends to the of Mount Sinai to receive the law, he leaves his brother in charge, which isn't always the greatest plan. Those of you who have brothers, I have great brothers. I would have no problem leaving them in charge. Aaron wasn't the best choice. Exodus chapter 32, starting in verse 1, when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people assembled about Aaron and said to him, which is basically a mob scene at this point, "Come and make us a god who will go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up from the land of Egypt, we don't know what has become of him." Here's what Aaron should have done in this scenario. What Aaron should have done is he should have said, "No. I know that Moses went up, but I know he's going to come down. I know that God isn't necessarily here at the bottom of the mountain, but he's right there. You can see him." Here's what Aaron did instead. He listened to the noise and said, "Tear off the gold rings," verse 2, "which are in the ears of your wives, your sons, your daughters, and bring them to me." Then all the people tore off the gold rings which were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. He took this from their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool, made it into a molten calf. And they said, "This is your God, O Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt." Really? The statue was Aaron? Verse 6, "So the next day they rose early, offered burnt offerings, brought peace offerings. The people sat down to eat and drink, and they rose up to play," which is the embodiment of idolatry. We're going to sit down and eat and drink, and then once worship's over, we're going to worship some more by playing around a little bit. Moses is furious. And in verse 19, when he comes down from the camp, or from the mountain, he says he saw the calf and the dancing, and Moses' anger burned. He threw the tablets from his hands and shattered them at the foot of the mountain. And he took the calf which they had made, burned it with fire, and ground it to powder, and scattered it over the surface of the water, and made the sons of Israel drink it. Verse 21, "Then Moses said to Aaron, 'What did this people do to you, that you have brought such great sin upon them?'" This is your chance, Aaron. You tell me right now, Moses says, why you acted in a way that is so polar opposites of what you know to be the truth. And Aaron's excuse is legendary. "Don't let the anger of the Lord burn, for after all, you know what these people are all about." You kind of with me on this. They're prone to evil. "And they said to me, 'Make me a god for us who will go before us, and for this Moses, the man who brought us up from the land of Egypt, we don't know what has become of him.'" In other words, it's kind of your fault, Moses, if you think about it. Verse 24, "I said to them, 'Whoever has any gold, let them tear it off.' And they gave it to me. I threw it into this fire, and out popped this calf." I don't even know where that came from. Verse 25, "Moses saw that the people were out of control, for Aaron had let them get out of control to be arisen among their enemies." Moses isn't fooled by it, and he sees exactly what the problem is. The problem is not the people, although, yeah, that's a problem. The problem is not Moses. It's certainly not God. The problem is Aaron let the people get out of control. Why? Because the noise was so intense. People formed a mob around him and said, "Look, we got to do something about this Moses. We got to do something about this Jehovah. We don't know where he's at." And Aaron said, "Got the ticket. What's going to make a calf? We're going to calm this down," and kind of compromise a little bit on this. Aaron let the noise get to him. And because he let that noise get to him, he made the worst possible decision he could probably make. And that's different than somebody like Moses. Exodus chapter 33, starting in verse 7, it says, "Moses used to take the tent and he used to pitch it outside the camp." And then the text has this little detail. That was a good distance from the camp. And he called it the tent of meeting. And everyone who sought the Lord would go out to the tent of meeting, which was outside the camp. And it came about that whenever Moses came out to the tent, that all the people would arise and stand, each at the entrance of his tent, and gaze after Moses until he entered the tent. Whenever Moses entered the tent, the pillar of cloud would descend and stand at the entrance of the tent, and the Lord would speak with Moses. When all the people saw the pillar of cloud standing at the entrance of the tent, all the people would arise and worship, each at the entrance of the tent. Thus the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face, just as a man speaks to his friend. And when Moses returned to the camp, his servant Joshua, Caleb's BFF, by the way, the son of Nun, a young man, would not depart from the tent. How did Moses handle the noise? Moses was probably, arguably, way more inundated on a way more regular basis than Aaron ever could. But Moses didn't listen to the mob. As a matter of fact, he does the pre-incarnation of the tabernacle. You have the temple, you have the tabernacle. Before that, you have the tent of meeting. And Moses sets this place up a good distance away from all these hooligans so that he can go into this tent and he can commune with God. A good distance from all those people. So that he can commune with God directly. You know where else you see that in Scripture? You see it with somebody like Jesus, who on at least 3 different occasions looks at the scenario around him and says, "Look, I've just got to take some time for myself. And it doesn't matter if there are people that need me. It doesn't matter if there are miracles to be done, teaching to be done. I am going to go out and I am going to spend some time with my Father." And as you think about what Moses did in this scenario, what we should do in our own life, that's what we should be doing too. Instead of giving into the noise and just kind of reacting guns blazing, shooting all over the place, which on a still frame on this video is going to look awesome, by the way. Instead of just kind of shooting from the hip, why don't we take some time? Why don't we have that different spirit and retreat into isolation, even if it's for a period of time, and spend some time with God in the midst of the noise? Martin Luther was famous for saying, I have so much to do today that I have to spend at least the first 2 hours of this day on my knees in prayer. That's the seclusion that we need. And we don't know everything about what made Caleb different. We don't know everything about his path. We certainly don't have details on any part of those 45 years, but we know where his faith stood at the end of it. And I would argue that through all those commotions and the murmurings and the rebellions that happened during those 40-plus years in the wilderness, Caleb remembered that promise. And he made sure his family stayed on course with that promise. Our kids are in a world today, I don't care if you count kids that's 3 years old or 80 years old, our kids today are in a very loud and noisy environment. And there are so many people vying to get their attention through a variety of different means, and I am not sitting here saying that we need to cut those things off. That's not what I'm arguing for. What I am arguing for is to provide some calm in the midst of that chaos. To be willing not only to retreat and commune with God yourself, but be willing to take your family and retreat in prayer with God. To bring some perspective to the situation. And instead of existing in a chaos-filled world where everybody's trying to do what they want to do, ask ourselves the question of our family, what's best for their spirit at this point? Is what's best for them to do this? Is it best for them to go there? Is it best for their soul to listen to this, to think about this? Or is it best for them and us as a family to pull back from that a bit? Do I have the different spirit to lead my family through a very, very turbulent and chaotic time? If you're here this morning and you've failed in that endeavor, join the club. We all have. I would ask for a show of hands, but every father, every male in this room would raise our hands at that point. So we've all failed in different ways. But we can start today. No matter what your relationship is like with your family, you can start today to bring that calm into their world and point their hearts towards Jesus as that influence. And maybe you're separated from God. Maybe you're on your own. You've got a family here that's ready to welcome you and to warm you up. If you would, just come as we stand and as we sing.